What causes a former high school swim captain, valedictorian, and registered nurse to go and drown her 5 children in the bathtub? Was she getting revenge on her husband for making her have so many kids and live in such tight quarters? Was it pure hatred? Or was she suffering from a mental illness? On the morning of June 20th, 1999, between 9 and 10 a.m., Andrea Yates waited until her husband left for work before filling the bathtub with water. One by one, she brought each of her children into the bathroom, drowned them in the bathtub, and then laid them back in bed and covered them with the sheet. She started with 3-year-old son Paul, then 2-year-old Luke, then 5-year-old John, then 6-month-old Mary. When 7-year-old Noah was called to the bathroom, he saw Mary face down in the tub and asked his mother what had happened. When Andrea didn't answer, he became frightened and went to run away, but was grabbed by his mother and drowned after putting up a fight for about 3 minutes. Noah, however, was too heavy for Andrea to carry, so she left his body floating in the tub. At 9:48 a.m., she called 911 asking for a police officer to report to her home, but not stating why. After she knew the police were on their way, she hung up with the 911 operator and called her husband Russell, telling him he needed to come home immediately. When he asked what was wrong and if any of the children were hurt, Andrea coldly responded, "Yes, all of them," and then hung up. Andrea and Russell were married in 1989 and celebrated the birth of their first son, Noah, on February 26, 1994. Shortly after, Andrea began to experience symptoms of postpartum depression by having visions of a knife that turned into stabbing and hurting someone. Andrea never told anyone of these visions until she was interviewed by a psychiatrist after her arrest. The American Psychiatric Association defines postpartum depression as severe mood changes and psychosis that occur within 4 weeks following the birth of a child. Symptoms can include fluctuations in mood, preoccupation with the well-being of an infant, and severe delusional thoughts with the increased risk of harming an infant. Almost 2 years after the birth of Noah, Andrea gave birth to another boy, John, on December 15, 1995. During this time, the family was living in a home in Texas but moved into a trailer in 1996 so Russell could do a NASA project in Florida. During their time in Florida, Andrea reported deep feelings of loneliness to Rachel Warneski. Michael and Rachel Warneski are Christian extremists who travel around the United States preaching God's word and how everyone needs to save their souls from the devil. Andrea wrote to Rachel in 1999 about these feelings, to which she was answered instructing to read Bible passages that told her that she should be devoting her life to her husband and children. While living in their trailer in Florida, the Yates family welcomed Paul into the world on September 13, 1997. Shortly after the birth of their third son, Rusty finished his project in Florida and moved them back to Texas in 1998 when he purchased the Warneski's 300-square-foot mobile home, which was a 1978 GMC bus remodeled and converted into a home. As Russell became more skeptical of the Warneski's preachings, Andrea became more and more religiously preoccupied and feared Satan overcoming her and her children. The family of 5 lived in the bus for little over a year. During this time, Luke was born on February 15, 1999. Andrea's depression was rapidly growing, as was her feelings of isolation and loneliness. Besides taking care of her husband and 4 boys, all under the ages of 5, Andrea was also caring for her father, who suffered from Alzheimer's disease. On June 17, 1999, Andrea went to her parents' home, stole her father's sleeping pills, and attempted suicide by overdosing on them. Andrea was hospitalized and diagnosed with severe depression. A few months later, Andrea again was hospitalized after her husband had to wrestle a knife out of her hand as she held it to her throat, threatening to slit it open. During the second hospitalization, she was diagnosed with severe depression with psychosis features because she was hearing voices and concerned that she might hurt somebody. Doctors also theorized that she might be schizophrenic. For the next year or so, Andrea continually saw her psychiatrist and took various antidepressants that seemed to work well. Russell Yates moved the family into a regular home, and life seemed to be getting back to normal. Despite her physicians telling Andrea not to have any more children, she gave birth to Mary Yates on November 30th, 2000. In March 2001, Andrea's father had passed away, and this, along with other various stressors and Andrea's past history of severe mental illness, is believed to have caused Andrea to do the unimaginable. This story became a highly publicized case because it was so unbelievable that a mother would be able to murder one of her children, let alone all 5 of them. Many people blamed Russell Yates for being neglectful and leaving his wife alone with the children even though he knew her deep history of mental illness. Gender bias became a big issue to the public because, although women could understand to an extent Andrea's emotional state, no one could understand how a man could do nothing to help his family. Many say that Russell's need for multiple children and horrible living conditions hurt Andrea and made her mental state worse. When clinical psychologist Dr. Gerald Harris evaluated Andrea shortly after her arrest, he found that she was having psychotic hallucinations of Satan on her wall jail cell. A psychologist appointed by the prosecution, Dr. Steven Rubenzer, also found that Andrea was mentally ill, was in no way faking her illness. In the state of Texas at that time, the legal standard of insanity is whether or not Andrea knew at the time of the drownings that her actions were wrong. Dr. Philip Resnick, an expert for the defense, testified that Andrea was remorseful for killing her children, but she did in fact commit these murders because she truly believed that the only way to save her children from Satan was by killing them while they were still innocent. She also believed that by being convicted and receiving the death penalty, that she'd be able to kill Satan. Although these killings were legally wrong, Andrea believed that she was morally right. Dr. Park Dietz, an expert for the prosecution, testified that Andrea fully knew her actions were wrong, but she did them anyway. Dietz is a forensic psychologist who was a consultant for the TV show Law & Order. When Andrea's lawyer asked him if any episodes had dealt with postpartum depression, Dietz said, and I quote, "As a matter of fact, there was a show of a woman with postpartum depression who drowned her children in the bathtub and was found insane, and it aired shortly before this crime occurred." Based off of Dietz's testimony, it was then speculated that Andrea had gotten the idea to drown her children in the bathtub after watching this episode of Law & Order, and this was all premeditated. It took the jury less than 3.5 hours to find Andrea Yates guilty of capital murder. However, later that evening, after Andrea's conviction, her defense attorney discovered that Law & Order had never aired an episode with that plot line. It had never even been written or pitched. During the sentencing hearing, Andrea's defense attorney called for a mistrial on the fact that Dietz's testimony was false, but a judge denied. The judge did, however, inform the jurors of this misinformation, and that helped Yates avoid the death penalty and just receive life in prison. After the trial, the jurors were interviewed by the defense and discovered that they were all persuaded by Dietz's testimony, and although they believed that she was mentally ill, Dietz's suggestion that Andrea got the idea from an episode of Law & Order was more convincing than the defense's evidence. Andrea's attorneys filed for an appeal in the Court of Appeals for the First District in Texas, claiming that the judge's failure to file a mistrial was a violation of Andrea's due process rights because the prosecution presented a witness who gave a false testimony. Andrea's case was reheard and the court's decision was in favor of her. This case is looked at when researchers are studying how gender roles can play a part into guilt by the public or provide sympathy. It is interesting to see how even though Andrea is the one who committed this crime, because she is a woman and a mother who had a lot of stressors and history of mental illness, generates more calls of sympathy toward her, while Russell, a man who seemed to have a pretty good life, is viewed as the evil one in this case and should be held responsible for the murder of his 5 children. This case is a sad one that many feel could have been prevented. Andrea Yates, without a doubt, was mentally ill at the time of the murders and should have been found that by the Texas criminal justice system. Their court system needs to have a better understanding of what mental illnesses are and define them better by law. Had their definition of mental illness not have been so constricted, Andrea would not have been given life in prison, but rather sentenced to a mental hospital where she belonged. Hopefully the criminal justice system can learn from this case and grow from here.